On Yom Tov, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippurim, the nusach or language of the tefillah, the prayers, is identical for Arvit, Shacharit, and Mincha. On Shabbat, the nusach for each tefillah is different. Why is this so?
The nusach or liturgy of the tefillah, that is to say what we call during the week the Shmona Esrei Barachot, or on Shabbat and Yom Tov, 7 barachot, the Sheva barachot of the tefillah, which is always based on the first 3 and the last 3 barachot, blessings of the tefillah, the silent prayer. And in the middle there is one central 7th baracha, which relates to the Shabbat or the Yom Tov in question. The question is, why on Shabbat do we find that this middle baracha, which is the 4th baracha of the tefillah, why is it different in the evening, Arvit, as opposed to Shacharit, the morning prayer, and again different for the Mincha, the afternoon prayer? Whereas on Yomim Tovim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim, we have one standard nusach of the tefillah, which goes as follows. I'm reading from a standard nusach Ashkenaz Sidur. Ata v'hartanu mikol ha'amim, ahavta othanu v'rasita banu. You chose us, Hashem, from amongst all the nations. V'qeravtanu malkenu la'abudathecha. I'm not reading it word for word. V'atiten lanu Hashem Elokeinu b'ahava mu'adim l'simcha hagim u'zmanim l'sason. And you gave us this festive day, this Chag, this Yom Tov, etc., etc. So it is for all the Yomim Tovim. So it is on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim. Why do we not find this nusach used as the opening to the 4th baracha of the tefillah on Shabbatot? Would this not be what we should expect? In Sefer Ha'itim, authored by Rav Yehuda bar Barzilai of Barcelona, nearly 1,000 years ago, on page 174, he quotes a teshuvah, a response of Rav Natunai Gaon, approximately 250 years or more before his own time. And the question goes as follows. I'm reading this teshuvah from Teshuvoth Rav Natunai Gaon, the first volume, on page 184. And with regards to your question, Tefilot shel Shabbat, shel Arvit, v'shel Shacharit, v'shel Mincha, the 3 prayers of Shabbat, evening, morning, and afternoon. Im omeram tefilah hath, do we use the same nusach, the same wording, keshem shanu mitparelim b'yom kippurim u'v'yomim tovim, as we do on Yom Kippur and on Yom Tov, on festival days, when the tefillah, the 4th baracha of the tefillah, is identical. Yosai dehovato or lo, and if one does recite the same nusach, does one perform his obligation? That is the question. Rav Natunai's response: Kach minhag b'shtei yeshivot. This is the practice in both yeshivot in Bavel, in Surah and Pumbeditha, the 2 great yeshivot, ubevet Rabbeinu sheba Bavel, and in the special Beth Midrash and Beth Knesset, in synagogue that was established by Rav in Bavel. Ba'arvith, in the evening prayer of Shabbat, Omer Avatecha, we recite the nusach which begins with the word Omer Avatecha. Uv'shaharith, Omer Yismach Moshe. Uv'mincha Ata Echad V'Shimcha Echad. Each tefillah has its own unique nusach, and he mentions the standard practice. We should note that Rav Natunai Gaon does not state that these tefillot on Shabbat must be different one from the other, nor does he explain why this is the common practice, the minhag. He simply points out that this is the practice, that each tefillah has its own version of that 4th baracha of the tefillah. A further thing to note with regards to that question and the response of Rav Natunai Gaon is that the questioner apparently found it unusual, and therefore he wrote to the Gaon. He imagined and expected that the nusach of the tefillah of the fourth beracha, the middle beracha of the tefillah of Shabbat, should be identical for all the tefillot, as it is on Yomim Tovim, as it is on Yom Kippurim, as it is on Rosh Hashanah. And it apparently struck him as unusual and strange that it not be so for Shabbat. We further find in Sidur Rav Saadia Gaon, a few generations after Rav Natunai Gaon, on page Kof Yod Aleph 111 in his Sidur, he writes as follows with regards to the tefillot of Shabbat. He says there are 7 barachot, Tefillat HaShabbat v'chen shekol hagim. The tefillah on Shabbat and all the hagim, all the Yamim Tovim, consists of 7 barachot, as we mentioned. Mogen u'mehayeh wa'el HaKadosh, the first 3. Ahar kach baracha imtza'it l'chol yom lefi inyano, a middle baracha for each day, based on the special content and significance of that particular day. Wa'ahar kach Raseh u'modim u'sim shalom. And then the last 3 barachot, as we mentioned, Raseh, modim, and sim shalom. So we have 7 barachot. And Rav Saadia Gaon continues, U'masafi et ha'masoret sha'baracha ha'imsa'ith shel arba tefilot ha'shabbat eina shawa ben tefillah l'haverta. The tradition, that is to say the practice, the minhag on the ground, with which I am familiar, states Rav Saadia Gaon, is that the middle baracha for these various tefillot of Shabbat is not identical. And then he brings the nusach of the tefillot for each of the tefillot of Shabbat. For the evening, he says, this is the nusach for the evening, me'ahavatecha Hashem Elokeinu she'ahavta et Yisrael amecha, etc. That's the nusach for the evening tefillah. In the morning he says, Yismach Moshe b'matanat halko. He also quotes here the nusach for Shabbat, which is clearly different, also on Yomim Tovim, because the entire thrust and theme of Tefillat Musaf, the additional tefillah on Shabbat and Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh, also is specifically related to the Korban Musaf, to the additional sacrifice on that day in the Mikdash, in the temple. He quotes the nusach for the tefillah of Musaf. The nusach he quotes is Tikanta Shabbat Rosita Korbanotheha. And for Minha, interestingly, he quotes 2 possibilities. He says, for Minha, the nusach begins Hanach lanu ki ata avinu u'meloch alenu mehera ki ata malkenu, which is a nusach that is unfamiliar to most people nowadays. And then he says, وَأَحَدِمْ مِمَنُ, and there are some, implying not the majority of us, in other words, of the Jewish people, مِتْپَرَلِمْ بِمْكُمَا, instead of that nusach for Minha, they say, أَتَا إِحَدْ وَشِمْخَ إِحَدْ. That is the nusach that is widespread today. So, for the 3 tefillot of Arvith, Shaharit, and Minha, putting Musaf aside for a moment, for the reasons that we explained, for those 3 tefillot, Arvith, Shaharit, Minha, we actually have 4 nuschot, 1 for the evening, 1 for the morning, and 2 possibilities for the Minha prayer. And again, in this remark of Rav Saadia Gaon, that the common practice which I find is to have a different version of that 4th beracha for each of the tefillot on Shabbat, I think it is plain that we can hear a subdued and unstated question, a kind of question mark in brackets. In other words, it's unusual. It's not like Yom Tov. It's not like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim. But this is the minhag that I find, and this is what I'm going to relate to you. From these sources, we understand that it is legitimate to ask the question, why is Shabbat different? Even more explicitly, we find in Sefer HaManhir, written by Rabbeinu Avraham bar Rabbi Nathan Hayarhi, of course, referring to the city from which he came, Lunel, the city of the moon. In his famous book, Sefer HaManhir, Hilchot Shabbat, page Kof Nun in the Musadar of Cook edition, he writes as follows, Rabbeinu Shlomo Zichrono Livracha, Lo haya omer Yismach Moshe. Rabbeinu Shlomo, Rashi, wherever you find in the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Shlomo Satam, without any additional explanation as to who we are speaking of, this refers to Rashi without any doubt. Rabbeinu Shlomo lo haya omer Yismach Moshe, in the morning on Shabbat, he did not say Yismach Moshe b'matanat halko, which was the standard nusach apparently. V'haya omer atav v'hartanu. He used to say instead atav v'hartanu on Shabbat. V'haya mazkir v'omer shabbathot limnuha. And he used to, in that nusach of atav v'hartanu, when you get to the point of mentioning the specific day, he said, "Vaya omer shabbathot limnuha." You gave us nathat lanu shabbathot limnuha, ki lo haya yodea ma inyan l'shabbath yismach Moshe. He claimed that this nusach of yismach Moshe b'matnat halko did not make particular sense to him. Why was this somehow related to Shabbat? Why was this the nusach chosen? We learn from this very interesting statement that Rabbeinu Shlomo, Rashi, not only changed his nusach of the tefillah on Shabbat from Yismach Moshe to Atav Hartanu, we also understand that Rashi felt that it was entirely legitimate and reasonable to do so. He did not think there was any halachic issue in so doing. By the way, this statement is mentioned a second time in Sefer HaManhir on page Chof Ayin Waw 176, and where he's speaking about the nusach of the tefillah on Yamim Tovim, and he says Gam Rash Nahag Le'omro. He's referring to Shabbat here, and he says that Rashi also used to say this nusach of Atav Hartanu on Shabbat. So there's no question that Rabbeinu Shlomo Rashi chose very deliberately to change from what was the standard practice in his day to recite on Shabbat the Baracha Atav Hartanu. And it follows logically that this was not only the case for Shacharit, but for all the tefillot of Shabbat. He goes on to say, here in Sefer HaManhir on page Kof Nun, Rabbeinu Yaakov, referring to Rabbeinu Tam, Ihzir al-davar liyosheno. Rabbeinu Yaakov, the grandson, Rabbeinu Tam, did not accept this change of his grandfather of Rashi, and he said that the nusach of Yismach Moshe should continue to be used. In order to further substantiate this claim that the nusach of Atav Hartanu, or theoretically another nusach, was recited for all the tefillot of Shabbat, for Arvit, Shacharit and Minha, again setting aside Musaf, which by definition should be expected to be somewhat different, although there too there's no reason to assume that Atav Hartanu was not the beginning, the opening of that fourth baracha of Musaf, and then the Nusach would go on to discuss the Korban Musaf. But setting that aside for now, Arvit, Shacharit and Minha, what was the Nusach? And do we have any further proof that it was one and the same Nusach for all those tefillot? We do in fact have such a proof. This is discussed amongst other places in this book I'm holding here, Tefillah Minharei Tefillah Eretz Yisraelim B'tkufat Genizah, by Professor Ezra Fleischer. And on page 27 he describes a fragment from the Genizah, which is not complete, unfortunately. So it begins in the middle of the description of the evening prayer. So we actually do not hear at the beginning of this fragment what the nusach in the evening was. But then it goes on to say, with regards to Minha on Shabbat, in the same fragment, it says, this is a translation from the Arabic instructions which were part of this manuscript, Sheva berachot al derech leil Shabbat or Yom Shabbat, hozrim aleh bilevad. In other words, this manuscript states plainly that for the Minha Tefillah of Shabbat, the afternoon prayer, one repeats the same fourth bracha as one does on Leil Shabbat or Yom Shabbat, in the evening or in the morning, the day of Shabbat. In other words, it was one and the same bracha. And therefore the conclusion of Professor Fleischer and other people who have investigated this matter, is that from this manuscript we understand that the author of this manuscript was not familiar with a different nusach for each of the tefillot on Shabbat, but rather one standard nusach, just as we have on Yom Tov. Another fact pointed out by Professor Fleischer is that this manuscript is not particularly ancient, and therefore this practice was known and commonplace in many communities, at least, till fairly recent times. When I say recent, I mean the early Middle Ages, or perhaps even later than that. One further very important and very explicit statement, which is very relevant to this discussion, we find in Sefer HaYashar of Rabbeinu Tam. Sefer HaYashar is a collection of Perushim, interpretations, commentaries, and Pesakim, Piskei Halacha of Rabbeinu Tam, the famous Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi. In Siman Shin Pei Teth, 389, on page 235, in the edition of Shimon Shlomo Schlesinger, we have a very brief three-line record that was somehow included in Sefer HaYashar, even though it is not claimed that it has anything to do with Rabbeinu Tam. But we do find certain ancient statements, pesakim, that is to say, halachic rulings and interpretations in Sefer HaYashar, which is a collection of almost exclusively Rabbeinu Tam's statements and commentaries, but occasionally some other information for various reasons was included, and this is one such example. It states as follows: Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, which should be understood not to refer specifically to Yerushalayim, the city, but rather to Eretz Yisrael in general, just as the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael is known as the Talmud Yerushalmi, for example. Korim Shema ba'amida b'perek rishon. The minhag in Eretz Yisrael, this is referring to some point during the Genizah or the Gaonic period in Eretz Yisrael. We cannot be more precise. Their practice is, when reciting Shema in the Beth Knesset, or also probably when alone, they stand during the first perek of Shema, which is the perek, the first section of Shema, which refers to Kabbalat Malchut Shemayim, accepting the yoke of heaven. They do so while standing. That is one statement. A further statement is, Uvaracha diru einenu ein omrim kol ikar. On the other hand, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael in Arvith, in the evening prayer, do not, after the Baracha of Hashkivenu, do not say Yiru Einenu and all the various Pesukim that were mentioned there, and the Baracha that was recited at the end of those Pesukim, which was the common practice in most of the Jewish world. And to this day it is the common practice in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel. Today in Eretz Yisrael this is not done. The Jews of Eretz Yisrael at that time also did not do so. So it says here. These are two separate pieces of information. One is not related to the other. And now we have a third statement, again unrelated to the previous statements. وَإِنَّمَا مُرِيمْ يِسْمَحْ Moshe. And in the morning on Shabbat they do not say Yismach Moshe. Just as Rashi did not wish to say this nusach in the morning of Shabbat, here it says that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, referring to a period well before Rashi's time, did not say Yismach Moshe, but what did they say? Ela atava hatanu. They used to say the nusach atava hatanu mikol ha'amim. Ad watitan lanu, until you get to the point in that nusach with which we are familiar. Ad watitan lanu Hashem Elokeinu be'ahava et yom hamenuha hazeh. That you have given us, Hashem, in your love of your people, you have given us this day of rest, Yom HaMenuha Hazeh, Lonuah Bo Ulishboth Bo, to rest and lishboth, to keep and perform the mitzvah of Shavita, which is refraining from all manner of work and usual weekday practices. And to keep this day for all time, as it is written in your Torah, etc. That is the end of this siman in Sefer HaYashar. Altogether, less than 3 lines. We have here, therefore, 3 separate pieces of information. From the sound, from the language, and the brevity of these statements, it is clear to those familiar with such things that these are ancient practices recorded here faithfully and precisely, relating to different minhagim, different practices of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, going back to a period well before Rashi, certainly during the Gaonic period, maybe even the very early Gaonic period. The 3 pieces of information again are: A, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael stand when reciting the first perek of Kriyat Shema, which is something we know from other sources, by the way. In Arvith, they did not recite Yiru Einenu after Hashkivenu, which is again the minhag of Eretz Yisrael today also. And thirdly, on Shabbat, they did not recite the bracha Yismach Moshe. They instead said Atav v'hartar mikol ha'amim, etc., until they got to the point regarding Shabbat, and they said Et Yom HaMenuha Hazeh lo nuach bo lishbot bo l'shomero. This is very possibly one of the sources that Rashi also saw that convinced him that this is what he should say on Shabbat. As to the original question, why do we have these various nuschaot nowadays, and in fact going back many generations, for the various tefillot of Shabbat? One can respond to this question and answer along 2 different planes altogether. One approach is to state that there are various allegorical, darshani explanations why we say this nusach for shaharit and this for minha, etc. And such explanations have been given over the generations. Another explanation, and it is this second explanation to which I subscribe, is that there is no particular reason. And in fact, it is not really a very valid question to ask, why do we say Yismach Moshe b'matanat Helko? Why is it not a valid question? Because let us ask ourselves a simple question. Do we know who authored this nusach? Do we know who authored the nusach for mincha, for arvith? We don't know. What we can say with certainty is that the phenomenon of paitanuth, of people who spent much time and wrote various piyutim, various liturgical poems and versions of the tefillah, felt, for various reasons, that it would be a nice idea to have a different nusach for the various tefillot, simply for variety, to spice things up. This was their approach, whether it was a correct approach or an incorrect, or shall we say, something that one does not have to accept or subscribe to. That's a separate question. But this was the approach of various people, various balei tefillah, shall we call them, people who spent much of their time discussing and explaining the nusach of the tefillah and writing new, interesting texts for the tefillah. It was their idea that there be these various nuschaot for Shabbat. To be more clear and precise, it was not that these paitanim, these liturgical poets and masters of tefillah in the post-Talmudic period, decided that there should be a different tefillah for arvith and for shaharit, and minha again should be different from the previous 2 tefillot. No. Various paitanim decided to write a certain version of that bracha, of that tefillah for Shabbat. We cannot say with any certainty at all which nusach was written by which paitan. Very possibly we don't even know the names of many of these paitanim. Various paitanim wrote various liturgically beautiful, poetical versions of the bracha for Shabbat. And because there were a number of such paitanim who wrote various versions, it became the general and widespread practice to employ all of these nuschaot. One was chosen for the evening, another was chosen for the morning, and a third was chosen for the mincha prayer. And this is exactly what we saw earlier in the Sidur of Rav Saadia Gaon. He mentions the nusach of Me'ah V'Atecha for Leil Shabbat, which is not the standard nusach today, which we will discuss later. Yizmach Moshe for the morning, and in the afternoon for mincha, Rav Saadia brought two nuschaot, Hanach Lanu and Ata Echad V'Shimcha Echad, two very different nuschaot. How did this come about? Again, the simple, straightforward, and historical answer is that there were many nuschaot out there, written by various chachamim, various paitanim, who deliberately chose to increase the variety and perhaps therefore the interest of the congregants with regards to the tefillah on Shabbat. They decided to write these various nuschaot of the tefillah, just as we find such poetically beautiful versions of Birkat HaMazon and other ancient texts that were revised or reworded in various ways by these paitanim. Each paitan wrote a nusach which he was able to create, and various communities decided to employ the various nuschaot for the various tefillot of Shabbat. This, without doubt, in my mind, is how this came about. So, if one asks the question, is it correct or is it acceptable to recite the standard nuschaot that we find today, where the fourth bracha of the tefillah on Shabbat differs from one tefillah to the next? Yes, the answer is it is entirely acceptable, because whatever nusach one recites, as long as one mentions the general theme and reality of Shabbat on that day, one is yotzer the chovah, one is performing his obligation. And this was obviously the understanding of all those paitanim who created these various nuschaot. It also follows, however, that it is also perfectly legitimate to recite what I believe is the ancient original nusach of Shabbat. This is also what Rashi understood. This is what we find in that unique, brief statement in Sefer HaYashar about the nusach of Eretz Yisrael on Shabbat. It is also entirely correct and legitimate to recite the nusach Hata V'Hartanu, which it is quite plain, also, as we mentioned, from the manuscript from the Genizah, quoted by Professor Fleischer, where it is obvious that the same nusach was used for all the tefillot, and this practice continued up to relatively late times. It is perfectly legitimate and correct to recite the nusach Hata V'Hartanu for all the tefillot, as we do on Yom Tov, as we do on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim. And this, Bezrat Hashem, is the nusach that will appear in the Sidur Nusach Eretz Yisrael, which we hope to publish in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.